First of all, is this thing blown out of proportion? Mr. Pruitt, is there a smoking gun?
There's more than a smoking gun. And I believe that ultimately the violations of law that we're probably going to end up seeing will be more than enough to bring the Trump presidency as we know it today to an end.
Mr. Fein, agree?
Well, it's certainly more than smoke, and if we can just review what these emails that Donald Trump Jr. disclosed, it's somewhat shocking. We need to begin by recognizing that under United States law, it is a crime for anyone to solicit anything of value in a political campaign from a foreign government. And the emails that Mr. Trump Jr. disclosed show that he received an email stating that the Crown Prosecutor of Russia, as part of an overall Russian government campaign to help Mr. Trump defeat Hillary Clinton, wanted to schedule a meeting in order to provide incriminating or damaging evidence on Miss Clinton, Mr. Trump's opponent. The mere solicitation of anything of value is itself a crime. And that's just one of the items, but I do want to correct at least the impression that now it's not yet agreed by the three members that you identified, Kushner and Trump Jr. and Manafort, that they will actually appear. The committee may have to subpoena them, and there could be an issue of their entitlement to any kind of privileges at that point.
Okay.
But at present, they have not individually agreed. Thank you.
Mr. Fein, I want to follow up what you just said about exactly what happened in 2016 during the election campaign. It is not a rare case for any of the candidates, even in history, to try to look for information that is not going to be positive for their opponents. Let's just say whether it is from inside the United States or from outside the United States. Why President Trump would argue this time would be different?
This is different because although nothing would have been wrong if Mr. Trump on his own, without trying to solicit the help of a foreign government, came up with opposition research, because you're absolutely right. Opposition research is a staple of political campaigns. But what's different is you can't get opposition research from a foreign government. That's been the law in the United States for 50 years. That's why it's different.
Here is the thing, Mr. Pruitt. One of the most important factors that needs to be decided is whether this so-called Russia government-related lawyer is really a lawyer sent by the Russian government, and also the links that President Trump and his campaign team, including his son-in-law, had contacted with, whether they are directly under the guidance of the Russian government. Because if you think about people, they could be in one way or the other linked to the government, one way or the other linked to the previous army, this and that, because Russia as a country, it used to be a communist country, and then 1989 it changed. But you know, think about all of this. It's complicated than just black and white, isn't it, Mr. Pruitt?
Well, it's complicated to the extent that it's multi-layered. The interesting dynamic here is how many of the layers connect and how the connections are made. And I think as you go through the various scenarios, you still come to the same conclusion that there was a level of collusion that was going on that will meet the test of a violation of U.S. law. And as such, where we're headed now is more a question of the efforts to cover up those collusive activities than it is just a simple finding of collusion between the campaign and these various Soviet Union sources.
Okay, we've heard from the two American guests about your views, particularly from within the United States. Let's go to Mr. Babich. I know you would portray it in a totally different way from Russia, but let me ask you about your general observation and your information and knowledge related to the people that have been mentioned in the reports that in a way suggested President Trump, when he was campaigning as candidate Trump, his team had contact with, whether they are Russia government related or not, to what degree? Mr. Babich, briefly.
Well, it's just strange for me to hear all of these accusations because, okay, there are laws and there is reality. The reality is that in the globalized world, of course, there are outside influences in every election because we are no longer separated from the foreign media. For example, in Russia, when President Putin got elected in 2012, there was a lot of negative information about him that came from foreign sources that was used by the opposition media here in Russia, and no one made a scandal about it. As far as this woman lawyer is concerned, first, she doesn't work for the government in Russia. She worked for a private client who wanted to be excluded from the so-called Magnitsky list. You know, Magnitsky list is the list of persons in Russia and in other countries whom the United States accuses of committing human rights violations. Well, that list is basically illegal. It's against Western values because it was conducted without trial. You know, people were declared guilty in the United States, and their assets were announced as frozen without any trial. So the whole thing simply doesn't hold water from the practical point of view and from the legal point of view.
I see. Mr. Babich, you got your own argument over there. Of course, it is a decision that has to be made by the American people and the American system itself, whether they want to have this president and whether this president is guilty of anything. So let me come back to the two American panelists about your views as well. There are three things going on right now. You got the Senate committee, that there's Judiciary Committee that is investigating about this. You got also the Congressional Intelligence Committee, the House is investigating about this. You also got the Justice Department investigation going on by Mr. Mueller over there. So what shall we make of these parallel investigations, and what are their functions? Are they going to support one another, cross-support one another, or actually they are going to work against one another? That is an interesting question. Mr. Fein, let's go to you first.
Well, I worked in that context. I was working in the Iran-Contra congressional investigation when Lawrence Walsh, the special prosecutor, was investigating violations of the Bolin Act. This related to the arms for hostages deal. And basically they work out an arrangement whereby, because if there's testimony that's immunized, that is, persons are compelled to testify in exchange for not being prosecuted, that there is evidence and time given to the prosecutor to park evidence to a judge before the open testimony so it can't claim that it's tainted. And right now, for example, it's publicly stated that Mr. Mueller, our special counsel who's running the Justice Department probe, has given the green light to the intelligence committees and to the Judiciary Committee that they may well investigate and question Kushner and Trump Jr. and Mr. Manafort, and he doesn't have any objection to that. So I think they're working, you know, in tandem here, and that's how it's happened, I say, ever since Watergate, which is 40 years ago, with these kinds of situations occur when you have a legislative and a prosecutor working parallel. I would like to make this one observation, though, is when you raise the question about the you know, the foreign lawyers, when Mr. Trump Jr. receives an email, it says nothing about the Magnitsky Act. It says nothing about adoption. It says only, we want a meeting with the Crown Prosecutor to discuss incriminating evidence against Hillary Clinton as part of a Russian government campaign to aid Mr. Trump. There's no ambiguity in that email. That's the problem with the email. To raise the Magnitsky Act, well, where does that come from? That's nowhere in any of the emails that Mr. Trump himself revealed.
Got your point. Mr. Pruitt.
And then one final point is that the Foreign Agents Registration Act, if these attorneys for the Russian government were basically acting to try to influence the outcome and the perception of Miss Clinton in her campaign, they would be required to register under our Foreign Agents Registration Act. I mean, that's quite clear. And the chairman of the Senate Judiciary Committee, Charles Grassley, today said he wants to ask questions about why that wasn't done.
Interesting question. One link to another, one after another, things coming out. Mr. Pruitt, let me ask you just some of the point your colleague just mentioned. First of all, about that cross investigation we mentioned earlier, do you think this is going to be bipartisan enough that all these investigations are going to be convincing to the American public?
Well, I think setting the standard of enough is always going to leave room for debate. So I think
right.
The question of whether or not there's enough bipartisan cooperation is still to be answered, and we'll have to wait and see the results of the investigation and the public reaction to that. But another point that you raised about the coordination, I would suggest to you that there's probably more coordination on this matter than we've seen on anything literally since Watergate. I think this is a critical time in our country's history. People understand the importance of the investigations and the potential impact that it can have, and the fact that it will, if it indeed results in a change of government, while we certainly have a history of peaceful and civil transitions, it will change the ball game for everyone in the world context, as it relates to trade negotiations, as it relates to military encounters and everything else, because of the changes in thinking that you get from one political group to another. And again, looking at the Trump team of he and Pence, they're not exactly on the same page. We're not intended to be on the same page, and we're one to now see a change there. You would upset the apple cart considerably, and the entire world would be scratching their head.
Since you talk about the American people and the public, let's look at what do they think about this. Of course, you could believe in polls or not believe in polls, particularly these days, but there are some polls. More than half of Americans say they don't fully trust President Donald Trump's dealings with Russia or Russian President Vladimir Putin, according to the new poll by PBS, the public broadcasting service, of course, that is. More than a third of Americans, 36%, think Mr. Trump has done nothing wrong while dealing with Mr. Putin, compared to 54% who believe Trump's dealings with Russia have been unethical or illegal. Of course, there are two very different issues. One is unethical, the other is illegal. Those are very, very, very different. But
very different.
Very different. Having said that, though, Mr. Pruitt, let me press one more time about one thing. That is, what about the fact that your colleague, Mr. Fein, talk about the foreign agent registration, because we see this investigation keep on dragging out different kinds of issues related to the U.S. relationship with foreign countries under a legal apparatus. The question really is, if this is as complicated as it is already become, will there be a way to judge or not whether this is going to be black or white? Because whether you want to have the president say he is guilty or not guilty, or his team is guilty or not guilty, this is something black and white. It is according to the law. So if you have a lot of blurring areas in different kinds of legislations going on over there, this is not going to have any conclusion, Mr. Pruitt.
Well, no,
and then,
it will have
of course, I will go to Mr.
and
Babich. Yeah, let's go to Mr. Pruitt first in the U.S. and then go to Mr. Babich. Mr. Pruitt first.
It will have conclusions. I mean, I, over the last 25 years, have been registered for any number of foreign governments and foreign entities that I have been involved in representing here in the United States, and essentially have been working, as is very much the case here, to impact and change U.S. policy as it relates to sanctions, as it relates to foreign assistance, as it relates to trade relations between these countries.
So your point is?
So there are fairly clear standards and requirements for anybody who plays in that game. It's almost like watching a soccer game. Either there was a score or not. You either have a goal or you don't, and there's very little debate and very little gray matter that can be argued here, which is again why we've seen in a number of instances with former players in the immediate Trump administration having to go back and retroactively register as foreign agents, because it is clear. It's just a question of whether or not the Justice Department feels they would gain something by prosecuting these individuals. And again, in this instance, and with the whole scenario that has evolved, it becomes a mechanism and a tool in their toolkit to try and find out what really did happen.
All right, let's go to Russia. Mr. Babich, your thoughts?
Well, let me remind our listeners that in 2012, Russia introduced a legislation on foreign agents which copied almost word for word the American Foreign Agents Registration Act from 1940. And at the time, there was a storm in the Western media, particularly in the American one. They said that the very notion of a foreign agent is unethical, it's outdated, it's dangerous. And now we see the American media and the congressmen and the so-called independent counsel use this expression, foreign agents, even more often than it was used in Stalin's times in Russia. So in this situation, I think we have double standards. Clearly, on the American side, we have double standards. And also, let me remind you again that basically the United States got involved in many elections in many countries. It got involved in the electoral battle in Ukraine. It got involved in the electoral battles in Eastern Europe. And never it was made into such a big problem. So my impression is that the Democrats and the globalists in the United States, they wanted Hillary Clinton to be the president. They were disappointed by her defeat. So now they are craving for revenge. And the fact that 54% of the American people tend to believe them, I think it's not a lot, it's not much, because 90% of the American mainstream media was for Hillary Clinton and against Mr. Trump. So there is no wonder that 54% of the people have suspicions. I think that if there was a fair coverage, the ratio would be very different.
All right. We hear different kinds of views, and it's only natural that we have different kinds of views. But eventually, of course, it is an American decision about their president. So let me ask you, before we wrap it up, the two American panelists, Mr. Fein, the most important thing now is about something related to President Trump. His authority as president. He's trying to exercise that to pardon his closer family members and also his aide as a result of now the flying around accusations against them. Can he have that? And is he going to test the limits of American presidency? Very briefly from you before we go to Mr. Pruitt.
Yes. Basically, the pardon power is unlimited, but it could be evidence of an attempt to obstruct justice. Also, if he used his pardon in that particular way, he could expose himself to impeachment and removal from office as an abuse of power, because impeachment does not require proof of a criminal violation. And he also needs to remember that once you pardon somebody, first, the recipient of the pardon has to agree that they violated the law. Secondly, once you have a pardon, you no longer have a Fifth Amendment privilege to remain silent, which means that all the people who he pardoned would be compelled to say, did you have any conversations with the president about all of these issues that caused him to issue pardons? So I think it would be a nightmare for him politically, even if it wouldn't expose him to criminal prosecution, which it might.
All right. Mr. Pruitt, anything to add about that?
Well, I just think it's a convenient discussion. His attorneys seem to be signaling at this point that it's part of their due diligence to look at all the options on the table. And I think they will continue to look at all the options. So I don't put much weight in the fact that he might use that preemptively, but I do think that it's certainly a tool that they want to fully understand.